Imagine the air growing thin, so brittle that every breath feels like inhaling shards of glass. Imagine the mechanical pulse of an engine straining against a wall of ice, the vibration rattling through the soles of your boots, until the numbness becomes the only constant in your world. Tonight, we are looking at a story of engineering pushed to the absolute edge of human capability. We are examining the 1935 B-10 mission, an expedition that sought to bridge the gap between aviation ambition and the unforgiving reality of the high-altitude alpine frontier. The B-10 was a marvel of its era, a pioneer of the all-metal monoplane design. Its twin engines were intended to slice through the atmosphere, yet in the thin, oxygen-deprived environment of the mountain ranges, these machines were fragile. They were not designed for the stillness of the peaks, but for the movement of the clouds. When a plane ascends into the high altitudes, it leaves behind the protective insulation of the lower atmosphere. The temperature drops with a mathematical cruelty. The metal skin of the aircraft contracts, groaning under the thermal shift. Lubricants thicken into a sludge that resists the turn of gears. Inside the cabin, the crew faced an environment that did not tolerate error. Instruments relied on the stability of external air pressure, which shifted violently in the erratic updrafts of the alpine crags. Every mechanical heartbeat was a gamble against the descent of the temperature. This was a time when the sky was still a new frontier. Aviators were tasked with mapping the limits of endurance, not just for the pilots, but for the structural integrity of the aircraft itself. They flew with the knowledge that the mountains below were vast, silent, and indifferent to their survival. The air was often so clear that it deceived the eye. Distances became fluid. A peak that looked reachable within minutes was actually miles of impossible terrain away. This was the landscape of the 1935 B-10 mission. Frozen altitude, the 1935 B-10 encounter. Chapter 1. The Mechanical Ascent. The Martin B-10 represented the pinnacle of tactical aviation in the mid-1930s. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and revolutionary in its configuration. The fuselage was clean, stripped of the drag-inducing external bracing wires that had defined the biplane era. It was designed to carry a payload into the heart of the skies. Yet, at high altitudes, the physics of flight began to shift. The air became too thin to provide the necessary lift for heavy flight surfaces. The engines, while powerful at sea level, began to starve for oxygen. Preparing for a high-altitude sortie required a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on the obsessive. Every ounce of weight was analyzed. The crew had to be lean, the fuel load balanced against the necessity of altitude, and the mechanical systems tuned to a razor's edge. In the hangar, the smell of aviation fuel and cold oil permeated the air. Mechanics worked in thick wool layers, their fingers moving with practiced, methodical precision. The B-10 was their charge, a beast of aluminum and rivets that had to perform when the world below vanished behind a curtain of clouds. The pilots understood the vulnerability of their position. At 30,000 feet, they were beyond the reach of any rescue. The ground was a geometric abstraction, a map of grey stone and white snow. The sky was a deep, darkening blue that suggested the vacuum of space. There was no sound in the cockpit other than the steady, rhythmic thrum of the two engines. It was a monotonous vibration that seeped into the marrow of the bone. It was the only reassurance that they were still airborne, that gravity had not yet claimed its due. To maintain altitude, the crew had to constantly adjust the pitch and the fuel-air mixture. The instruments were sensitive, jittering slightly as the aircraft fought the turbulence of the mountain currents. They watched the needles, their eyes tracing the delicate movements of mercury and wire. In these altitudes, the B-10 was essentially a fragile shell, holding back a lethal environment. The outside air temperature could hover near 60 degrees below zero. Even if the cabin were sealed, The cold would eventually permeate the structure. The heat of the engines was the only defense against the creeping ice. Yet, this heat could not reach the extremities of the wings, where moisture from the clouds would strike the aluminum and instantly crystallize. Ice accumulation was the silent enemy of the flight. It did not arrive with a warning. It appeared as a dull white film along the leading edges of the wings. It disrupted the flow of air, creating drag where there should have been lift. It added weight that the aircraft was not designed to carry. As the B-10 moved over the alpine ridges, the crew noted the change in the engine sound. The smooth vibration became ragged. A subtle instability began to ripple through the airframe. The struggle between the machine and the mountain had begun. The pilot looked down at the altimeter. The needle was steady, but the ground was rising to meet them. The mountain peaks of the range were reaching toward the belly of the plane, jagged teeth of granite masked by a thick blanket of pristine, untouched snow. There was no room for deviation. The flight path was calculated, but nature rarely follows a vector. The wind gusts off the mountains were unpredictable, capable of dropping the aircraft hundreds of feet in a single silent plunge. The crew sat in their stations, bodies tense, listening to the strained whine of the engines. They were isolated in the vastness of the troposphere. The silence of the high mountains began to press against the thin walls of the fuselage. The struggle for altitude was a battle against the inevitable downward pull of the Earth. Every foot of elevation gained was a fight. Every mile covered was a victory for the engineering of the B-10. Yet the mountain range ahead was unrelenting. The fuel gauges were watched with a clinical intensity. In the thin, cold air, the engines consumed fuel at a rate that defied the initial projections. The efficiency they had enjoyed on the ground was a memory, lost to the necessity of constant power. The interior of the plane grew colder by the minute. The breath of the crew condensed on the cold metal surfaces, forming thin, delicate patterns of frost. The moisture of their own bodies was being stolen by the environment, leaving them dehydrated and sluggish. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley floors far below. The light turned the mountain peaks into glowing pillars of ice. The beauty was immense, but it was the beauty of a tomb. The radio static was a harsh intrusion, a reminder of the distance between them and the base. There was no meaningful communication possible through the interference of the high peaks. They were on their own, navigating a geography that had never been fully charted for such heavy aircraft. The navigator leaned over his table, his compass and protractor laid out with precision. His movements were slow, deliberate, hampered by the layers of clothing and the creeping fatigue of high altitude. He was searching for a pass, a gap in the stone that would allow them to clear the range. The plane banked slowly, the wings tilting against the resistance of the thin air. The shift was agonizingly slow, a heavy, dragging turn that tested the structural limits of the fuselage. The engines roared, a defiant sound against the absolute silence of the peaks. They were flying into the heart of the alpine winter. The weather reports had promised clear skies, but the mountains created their own weather. A wall of mist was gathering to the north, a dense, swirling mass that threatened to swallow their visibility entirely. As the plane skirted the edge of a massive granite cliff, the air became turbulent. The B-10 bucked, the frame shuddering as the wing caught a fierce thermal updraft. The crew braced themselves, not with shouting, but with the silent, practiced focus of those who understand the stakes. The vibration in the controls increased. The engines were laboring, the sound becoming a low mechanical growl. The fuel mixture was adjusted again, the needle of the gauge dropping with a finality that settled in the pit of the pilot's stomach. They were now at the threshold of the mission's endurance. The B-10 had been built to be the best, but even the best had limits defined by the laws of physics. The alpine cold was a constant, and the altitude was a predator. The light continued to fail. The deep bruising purple of the high-altitude twilight began to consume the landscape. The stars would soon emerge, cold and distant, offering no warmth to the men who were now truly alone in the sky. The pilot eased the throttle forward, trying to coax just a bit more performance. From the engines, he could feel the aircraft struggling to maintain the equilibrium of flight. He looked at the instrument panel. the dials glowing with a faint phosphor light in the dimming cockpit. The realization settled over them like the encroaching frost. The mission, intended to showcase the future of flight, was rapidly turning into a struggle for the present. The mountains were not going to yield, and the machine was beginning to show the fatigue of the journey. A sudden, sharp drop in engine temperature caught the engineer's eye. The oil pressure gauge flickered, a warning of the thickening fluid in the lines. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience. It was becoming a mechanical adversary. The B-10 continued its path, a dark shadow against the white expanse of the mountain range. It was a testament to human ingenuity, yet against the scale of the alpine wilderness, it was small. And it was slowing down. The silence of the mountain air seemed to thicken. It was as if the altitude itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the machine would finally lose its battle with the cold. The descent, once a distant fear, now felt like a mathematical certainty. The pilot kept his hand steady on the yoke. There was no panic, only the grim, silent assessment of the situation. Every action was a measured effort to preserve the integrity of the flight, to keep the B-10 in the air for just one more mile, one more ridge, one more chance to reach the other side. The clouds ahead began to swirl, picking up the last of the dying light. They appeared solid, a rampart of vapor blocking the passage. The aircraft pushed forward, its nose dipping slightly as the thinning air failed to support its weight. The interior grew colder still. The glass of the gauges began to cloud over with frost. The crew reached for their gloves, their fingers stiff and clumsy. They were losing the battle with the elements, one layer of ice and one lost pound of pressure at a time. As the shadows lengthened, the B-10 reached the spine of the central range. Below them lay the vast, darkened expanse of the mountain basin. There was no landing zone, no hope of support, only the harsh, unforgiving geometry of the rock and the snow. The final surge of the engines echoed against the peaks. The power peaked, wavered, and then began a slow, rhythmic decline. The machine, once a master of the air, was now surrendering to the pull of the mountains. The darkness moved in from all sides, closing the gap. The mission had reached its final, silent chapter. The altitude, the cold, and the engineering limits had intersected, leaving the crew with the reality of their surroundings. They were no longer flying. They were merely waiting for the mountain to claim the remainder of their journey. The altimeter needle vibrates against the frosted glass, a steady rhythmic pulse in the cockpit of the B-10. Outside, the night air is thick with invisible currents. The metal skin of the fuselage groans under the relentless contraction of the cold. At 10,000 feet, the world below is merely a suggestion of jagged obsidian peaks. The moon casts a pale, unforgiving light across the snow-dusted ridges. The engine exhaust leaves a faint, dissipating trail in the thin atmosphere. Suddenly, the hum changes. It is not a loud or violent shift, but a deep mechanical sigh. The vibration in the floorboards hitches. The primary engine's rhythm falters. The steady thrum that has been the crew's only companion for hours begins to stutter. There is a sharp metallic pop from the cowling, followed by a rhythmic knocking that travels through the airframe. The oil pressure gauge drops. The needle slides toward the red zone with agonizing slowness. A thin plume of smoke begins to lick at the edges of the engine housing. It is pulled backward by the slipstream, trailing into the darkness like a ghost. The heat within the engine bay is lost to the biting wind outside. The pilot adjusts the throttle, but the engine does not respond. The power output begins to bleed away. The aircraft starts to lose its steady altitude, dipping into a subtle, unintended nose-down attitude. The air inside the cabin grows colder as the heating vents cycle down. Moisture from the crew's breath begins to crystallize on the inner windows. The frost grows in delicate fern-like patterns, obscuring the view of the treacherous terrain. The co-pilot watches the tachometer. The rotation speed of the propeller begins to diminish. The sound of the engine shifts from a low drone to a hollow windswept whistle. There is no panic. There is only the weight of the inevitable. The B-10 is becoming a glider in a landscape that offers no flat ground. The aircraft begins to settle into a drift. The control surfaces feel sluggish in the thinning, freezing air. The weight of the machine is no longer countered by the thrust of the engines. The crew observes the descent with a clinical detached focus. They check their gear, securing loose items that might shift during the transition to a landing. The interior of the cockpit is now entirely silent, save for the whistling of the wind against the fuselage seams. Below them, a large uncharted basin appears through the shifting clouds. It is a vast white expanse of deep snow, trapped between towering rock walls. It is a graveyard of geography, indifferent to the metal bird descending toward it. The pilot moves the flight controls with deliberate, measured motions. The B-10 begins a wide, sweeping turn to line up with the snow-covered slope. The descent rate increases, turning the flight into a slow, inevitable drop toward the basin floor. The smell of ozone and burning metal begins to permeate the small, cramped cabin. It is a sharp chemical scent that stands in stark contrast to the sterile, freezing air outside. The altitude needle passes 8,000 feet. The jagged mountain tops seem to rise up to meet them, shifting from silhouettes into distinct, frozen monsters. The details of the terrain become clearer: crevasses, wind-sculpted drifts, and exposed rock faces. The engine gives one final jarring shudder. The propeller blades reach a standstill, fixed against the backdrop of the stars. The silence that follows is absolute. The aircraft is now merely an object of gravity. It glides through the darkness, seeking purchase on the white carpet below. The air rushing past the wings sounds like a distant, roaring ocean. The temperature in the cabin is plummeting. The metal frame of the aircraft is turning into a heat sink, drawing the warmth from the air and the skin of the crew. Each breath taken is a cloud of white vapor. There are no words spoken. The crew monitors the descent, their eyes locked on the darkening basin. They are searching for a patch of snow that might hold their weight, rather than swallow them whole. The ground is rushing upward. The scale of the mountains becomes overwhelming, dwarfing the B-10. It is a silent, creeping approach, devoid of the chaos of an accident. It is simply the physics of a machine returning to the Earth. The landing gear will be useless here. The deep, untouched snow will act as both a cushion and a trap. The crew prepares for the impact, bracing themselves against the interior bulkheads. The basin is a flat, pale void under the moonlight. As the altitude drops below 5,000 feet, the texture of the snow becomes visible. It is not smooth, but undulating, marked by the violent wind patterns of the high altitudes. The plane continues its steady, unpowered glide. The angle of descent is shallow, calculated to preserve as much speed as possible until the final moment. The B-10 is an arrow aimed at the heart of the wilderness. The air pressure begins to change as they enter the bowl of the basin. The wind swirls around the fuselage, catching the wings and causing the aircraft to tilt. The pilot corrects with slow, heavy movements of the yoke. 3,000 feet. The silhouettes of the rocks are now towering over the flight path. The basin walls seem to close in on either side. The cold is now a physical weight. It stiffens the joints and dulls the senses. Every movement requires intense, conscious effort. The crew is beginning to feel the onset of the numbing, a slow paralysis that mirrors the cooling of the aircraft. The plane levels out slightly as it approaches the center of the basin. The floor of the snowfield looms. It is a pristine, terrifying expanse that has not seen a footprint in centuries. 2,000 feet. The shadow of the B-10 glides across the snow, a dark, fleeting shape on the white surface. It is a phantom flight. The pilot watches the terrain. He is looking for the deepest drifts, hoping to slow the inevitable slide. The ground is a blur of white and grey, rushing closer with a relentless, hypnotic cadence. 1,000 feet. The roar of the wind is the only sound in the world. The cabin is now freezing, the metal walls radiating a lethal, biting cold that saps the life from the air. 500 feet. The snow is rising up, swirling into the slipstream of the passing aircraft. The B-10 is about to leave the sky. Before we descend further into the dark, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. You won't want to face the rest of this journey alone. And before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Knowing you are out there, somewhere in the dark, makes this history feel all the more alive. The altimeter needle vibrates against the pin. The roar of the engines is replaced by a high-pitched, metallic whine as the propeller blades bite into the thin frozen air. The B-10 does not descend so much as it settles. The belly of the aircraft makes contact with the high basin's crust at 60 miles per hour. There is no explosion. There is only the sound of shearing metal. The snow acts as a massive, unforgiving shock absorber. It curls up over the nose in a white wave. The fuselage jerks forward, then abruptly stops. Inside, the inertia is absolute. Bodies are thrown against hard, riveted walls. There is a momentary suffocating silence before the realization of survival settles in the cabin. The air is immediately replaced by the scent of spilled aviation, fuel, and ozone. Every movement is accompanied by the groaning of the airframe. The skin of the aircraft is settling into the drift, shifting under the weight of the snow. Outside, the wind is not a gust, but a constant, low-frequency hum. The temperature is 42 degrees below zero. The metal of the B-10 is already leaching the heat from the interior. The pilot unlatches the canopy. The seal is frozen shut. He uses the heel of his hand to strike the release mechanism. It gives way with a sharp, percussive crack. A plume of powdered snow enters the cockpit. It does not melt. It settles like fine dust on the instruments. The horizon is a flat, featureless line of blinding white. The crew begins to move, their bodies stiff from the sudden deceleration. Every breath creates a plume of dense vapor that clings to their goggles. They reach for the emergency kits, their movement slowed by the heavy wool-lined flight gear. Captain Miller is the first to exit. He drops down into the snow. It reaches his waist. The crust is dense, packed by centuries of wind, but underneath lies a deep soft powder that threatens to swallow his boots. He walks the length of the fuselage. The belly is scarred. A long, jagged tear in the aluminum plating runs along the underside of the starboard wing. Fuel is weeping from the damaged line. It is thick and sluggish, turning into a dark, viscous slush as it hits the ice. It does not evaporate. It stains the pristine white basin, a stark, industrial wound in a landscape that has never known the presence of a machine. The landing gear has vanished. The wheels are buried deep beneath the surface, anchors keeping the B-10 tethered to the basin floor. The tail section is twisted at a slight angle, pointing toward the ridgeline. The remaining crew members emerge one by one. They do not speak. They move with the careful, deliberate rhythm of men operating in a vacuum. They begin the assessment. It is a clinical process. Each man knows that the aircraft is now their only shelter against the high-altitude pressure. One of the mechanics crawls beneath the fuselage. He is wearing thick leather gloves, but his fingers are already numb. He traces the structural fractures with the edge of his palm. The frame is bent. The main spar has taken the brunt of the impact. It is deformed, a subtle curve that would be imperceptible in a hangar, but is catastrophic here. The B-10 will not fly again. There is no panic in this discovery. There is only the heavy settling weight of finality. The mission has changed from a navigational task to a static occupancy. They begin to clear the snow from the fuselage door. The cold is not just a sensation. It is a physical force that dictates the speed of their labor. Every minute of exertion requires a period of forced rest to keep the heart rate from spiking. They have 3 days of iron rations and 2 heavy canvas tarps. Their secondary survival gear is buried somewhere in the forward hold. They start to dig, moving the snow in slow, rhythmic shifts. The sky above begins to turn a bruised, a deep purple. The sun is dropping behind the peaks of the basin. As the light fades, the shadows grow long and sharp, erasing the depth of the snowdrift. The temperature drops another 5 degrees. The sound of their breathing is amplified in the thin air, a rhythmic, laboured wheezing. The static electricity in the air makes the hair on their arms stand up beneath their layers of wool. They pull the crates from the belly. They are intact. The shock of the landing was distributed well, sparing the cargo from splintering. They pile the supplies against the side of the fuselage. It creates a makeshift wall, a temporary windbreak. It is an attempt to create an environment separate from the vast, indifferent basin. The wind picks up. It carries fine ice crystals that scour the skin like needles. Every exposed patch of flesh turns a waxy, translucent white within seconds. Captain Miller checks the radio transmitter. He finds the unit mounted to the bulkhead. The glass vacuum tubes are intact. He flips the toggle. The device remains dead. The vibration of the impact has severed the connection to the external antenna trailing behind the tail. The wire is gone, sheared off during the slide through the drift. He runs a hand over the dial, clicking it back and forth. There is no hiss, no feedback. There is only the absolute sterile silence of the high altitude. The crew gathers inside the fuselage. They sit on the floor, backs against the interior skin. The metal is freezing, radiating a cold so profound it feels like a burn. They wrap themselves in the tarps. The fabric is stiff, freezing into a rigid shell. They do not talk about the distance to the nearest station. They do not discuss the lack of a signal. They watch the light die completely. The basin disappears into a total, featureless dark. The only way to know the world still exists is the gentle, intermittent shifting of the B-10 as it settles deeper into the snow. A low, vibrating sound begins to resonate through the fuselage floor. It is the sound of the glacier beneath them, grinding against the bedrock of the basin. It is a slow, tectonic movement that tells them they are not resting on solid ground, but on a vast, shifting mass of ice. The crew stares into the dark. They are listening. The wind has stopped, but the ice is moving. The structural integrity of the fuselage is being tested by a force they cannot see and cannot stop. Outside, the temperature continues to plummet. The metal shell of the B-10 begins to contract. It makes a series of sharp, rhythmic pings, like the sound of a clock ticking in an empty room. The crew sits perfectly still. They are realizing that the descent was only the beginning. The basin is not a place of refuge. It is a vessel. The floor beneath them tilts by a fraction of a degree. The sound of the ice grinding against the mountain floor grows louder, a deep subaudible moan that vibrates through their marrow. They are drifting, and in the dark, they realize the B-10 is no longer stationary. The aluminum fuselage of the B-10 bomber rests at an awkward angle against the slope. Inside, the metal hull groans as the temperature shifts. Frost patterns bloom across the interior rivets, intricate and sharp. The air is thin at this altitude. Every breath requires conscious effort. The men move with deliberate, measured slowness to preserve oxygen and warmth. Captain Miller begins the process of inventory. He moves through the cabin with gloved hands. He checks the storage lockers and the cramped compartments beneath the seats. The findings are sparse. The B-10 was designed for speed and tactical maneuvers, not for prolonged habitation in a subarctic environment. The military planners had accounted for short-range missions. They had not accounted for this landscape of ice. There are 6 tins of hardtack, 3 canisters of canned peaches, and a small bag of dried coffee grounds. There is no emergency cold weather gear. There are no tents. Miller clears the frost from the floorboards. He lines up the supplies on a flat section of the cargo floor. The inventory is complete in under 10 minutes. The silence that follows is heavy. It is a physical weight that fills the cabin. The supplies represent barely 3 days of intake if they ration them strictly. Outside, the wind picks up. It produces a low, oscillating hum against the corrugated skin of the aircraft. It is a sound of constant friction, never breaking. The crew gathers around the small pile of tins. No one speaks. The gravity of the situation settles into the marrow of their bones. They are isolated in a territory that is not marked on their navigation charts. Navigation Officer Hayes unfolds a crumpled map on the pilot's yoke. He traces a finger along the line of their flight path. The lines are blurred by water, damage from the condensation that has leaked into the cockpit. He estimates their position. oxygen relative to the nearest civilian outpost. The math is simple, and it is devastating. They are separated from civilization by miles of jagged, untracked mountain passes. The terrain is vertical. It is a labyrinth of snow-choked ravines and ice fields. Even in perfect weather, a trek of this length would be an impossibility. With their current caloric intake, their bodies will begin to cannibalize themselves within 48 hours. The metabolic process of staying warm in this climate burns fuel at an accelerated rate. They are burning their own reserves while staring at the empty metal canisters. Lieutenant Vance checks the aircraft's radio housing for the third time. The wiring has been shredded by the impact against the rock face. The copper strands are brittle, snap like dry twigs. There is no signal. There is no way to reach the base, and no way for the base to know their location. They are a speck of debris in a vast white expanse. They observe the horizon through the cracked plexiglass of the cockpit. The sun is beginning its descent. The sky turns a bruised, deep shade of violet. The light failing outside signals the beginning of another night. The temperature is projected to drop another 20 degrees by midnight. The steel of the B-10 will become a heat sink, drawing the remaining warmth directly from their bodies. They sit on the floor, backs against the bulkhead. They arrange their coats to cover their legs. The sensation of hunger begins to manifest as a dull, throbbing ache behind the sternum. Every movement is now a tactical decision. To stand up is to lose heat. To move is to consume the energy they do not have. They watch the tins of peaches sitting in the center of the cabin. The metal reflects the dim, fading light. It is an image of fragile utility. The wind intensifies outside. It forces fine powder-like snow through the gaps in the airframe. The particles settle on their shoulders and coat their collars. The men pull their scarves tighter. They watch the shadow stretch across the interior of the fuselage. The daylight is almost gone. One of the men notices that the seal on the final tin of peaches is slightly compromised. A thin, viscous trail of syrup has leaked out, freezing into a jagged amber spike on the cabin floor. They watch it closely. The resources are already failing them. The structural integrity of their only shelter is beginning to yield to the pressure of the mountain. They wait for the total darkness to settle over the wreckage. The fuselage of the B-10 lies angled against the frozen slope, a carcass of aluminum and glass embedded in the permafrost. The silence here is absolute, broken only by the thin high-pitched whistle of wind threading through the jagged tears in the hull. Inside, the metal is cold enough to peel skin from bone upon contact. The crew of the B-10 moves with calculated sluggish movements. Every motion is a measured investment of calories they can no longer afford to replace. To survive the night, the interior of the fuselage must be transformed into a closed environment. The first task is the stripping of the insulation. They use pocket knives to peel back the layers of fiberglass and cork lining the cabin walls. This material, designed to dampen engine vibration, now serves as the only barrier between their bodies and the conductive chill of the aircraft skin. They layer the salvage over the aluminum floorboards. The floor is slick with a thin glaze of ice, the result of frost melting from their heavy flight suits and refreezing into uneven ruts. Each scrap of material is precious. They overlap the patches, pinning them into place with salvaged bolts and wiring. The fuselage panels, twisted during the landing, are pried back into position. They are heavy, cold, and stiff with frost. The men work in pairs, moving slowly to conserve oxygen and heat. They use the discarded bolts from the landing gear assembly to seal the gaps in the fuselage skin. A draft is a silent adversary. It carries the moisture of the outer atmosphere directly into their makeshift quarters. They pack the gaps with torn strips of canvas from the cockpit upholstery. The wind is a persistent force pushing against the thin metal shell, testing the integrity of their barricades. Their breath hangs in the air, a visible heavy vapor. Within the confined space, this moisture is a danger. It settles on the ceiling and the interior walls, turning into a fine, crystalline rime that grows thicker with every passing hour. If it melts, they will be soaked. If they remain soaked, Hypothermia is inevitable. They begin the engineering of a condensation shield. Using the discarded canvas maps and spare flight overalls, they fashion a draped canopy across the ceiling of the cabin. It is pitched at a slight angle, intended to catch the dripping frost and funnel it toward the floor, away from their bodies and bedding. The architecture of their shelter is primitive and cramped. The ceiling sits only inches above their faces as they lie on the floor. It is a world of confined proximity, defined by the smell of stagnant aviation fuel and the biting sharpness of ozone. Every action is punctuated by the rhythmic thumping of the wind against the fuselage. The ship shifts occasionally, settling deeper into the ice. The sound is a low metallic groan that vibrates through the floorboards and into their marrow. It is a reminder that the B-10 is not a structure, but a machine in the process of being dismantled by the elements. They manage to carve a small, circular opening in the lower hull for ventilation. It is a precarious balance. If the hole is too large, the heat dissipates into the void. If it is too small, the accumulation of carbon dioxide and water vapor will suffocate them in their sleep. They cover the opening with a heavy piece of leather, weighted down with a single heavy bolt, so it can be nudged open or closed with a gloved hand. Space is allocated with geometric precision. They arrange themselves in a tight circle on the insulated floor, heads toward the center. This is the only way to retain the ambient heat produced by their bodies. They are locked into a configuration of shared survival. The light outside is fading, retreating into a bruised, monochromatic grey. Inside, the shelter is dark, illuminated only by the faint bluish glow of the snow reflecting through the cockpit glass. They lie motionless, listening to the shift of the wind and the subtle rhythmic expansion and contraction of the cooling metal. The weight of the temperature outside is pressing in. The insulation material, while effective, is already showing signs of saturation. The moisture in the air is relentless. It coats their goggles, their gear, and the surfaces of the cabin in a fine white powder. They wait for the sleep that is as dangerous as it is necessary. To drift off is to risk a lowering of body temperature that might not be reversed. To stay awake is to invite the slow, numbing exhaustion that leads to mistakes. The shelter is silent, save for the labored, steady rhythm of their breathing. The cabin is no longer a plane. It is a pressurized vault of endurance. Outside, the wind begins to pick up, its pitch rising from a low moan to a sharp, insistent whine. The bolt securing the leather flap at the ventilation port rattles. It is a light, intermittent sound, barely audible over the gale, but in the silence of the shelter, it is a marker of the pressure building on their fragile boundary. They lie still, feeling the vibration of the wind through the metal under their backs. The structure holds, for now, but the frost is creeping closer, tracing patterns along the seams of their clothing, reaching for the heat they have so carefully guarded. The night is deepening. The cold has moved past the exterior skin and is now probing the thickness of their insulated floor. One of the men shifts his position, his movement causing the canvas canopy above to drip a single icy drop of water. It lands on his cheek, a sharp, stinging reminder of the external reality they have failed to completely exclude. Outside, the wind reaches a crescendo, slamming against the tail section with enough force to make the fuselage shudder. The frame groans under the strain, a sound of metal fatigue that resonates through the floor. They freeze, holding their breath, waiting to see if the rivets will hold. The B-10 wreckage sits nestled in a bowl of jagged limestone. The fuselage is a skeleton of duralumin, twisted by the impact against the mountainside. Outside, the alpine wind carries a persistent, crystalline grit. Inside the cabin, the air has grown thin. Every movement requires a deliberate, taxing expenditure of energy. The crew operates in a state of suspended animation. Temperature remains the primary adversary. The thermometer fixed to the instrument panel dropped below the freezing point hours ago. The interior walls are coated in a thin velvet layer of rime ice. The metal surfaces have become dangerous, Contact with bare skin results in an immediate searing adhesion. The crew has learned to handle their supplies through thick, wool-lined gloves. Their clothing is inadequate for the altitude. The leather flight jackets provide a barrier against the wind, but they do not retain core heat. They have wrapped their limbs in shredded parachute silk. The silk is thin and fragile. It offers little insulation against the biting cold. They huddle together near the center of the cabin, attempting to share the meager warmth of their proximity. Each man monitors the others with clinical detachment. They watch for the telltale signs of frostbite on exposed skin. The nose, the ears, and the fingers are the first points of failure. When the skin turns a waxy porcelain white, the protocol begins. They rub the affected area with dry, wool-covered hands. It is a slow, rhythmic process meant to draw circulation back to the surface. The sensation of returning blood is agonizing. It creates a throbbing, needles and pins intensity that persists for hours. Yet, it is the only way to prevent the tissue from blackening and dying. Oxygen levels at this altitude are barely sufficient for sedentary survival. Every breath is shallow and sharp. Their chests rise and fall with a heavy, laboring rhythm. Lethargy is the greatest threat. The mind begins to wander, drifting away from the harsh reality of the wreckage. They must constantly check each other to ensure the others remain conscious. They speak only when necessary. Vocalization requires more oxygen than they can comfortably spare. The cabin is filled with the sound of labored, rasping respiration. The physical decay of the environment mirrors the internal decay of the body. They have begun to lose the ability to perform fine motor tasks. Buttoning a coat or sharpening a pencil takes an eternity of effort. The joints are stiffening. The synovial fluid in their knees and elbows has become viscous in the cold. Every change of position is a slow, grinding, mechanical struggle. They rotate their positions regularly. Those who sit against the exterior walls bear the brunt of the convective heat loss. By rotating, they distribute the risk of deep hypothermia across the entire group. They have established a rotation schedule for observation. 2 men sleep while 2 remain awake, eyes tracking the horizon for any sign of a shift in the weather. The fatigue is immense. It manifests as a heavy dragging weight in the eyelids. It is an immense psychological task to keep the eyes open. They fight the urge to drift into the quiet darkness of sleep. The silence of the mountains is absolute. It is a vacuum that pulls at their sanity. There are no birds at this altitude. No rustle of vegetation, only the sound of the wind against the fuselage. The wind has an abrasive quality. It sounds like sand being thrown against a window pane. It is constant, a reminder of the vast, indifferent landscape surrounding them. Their diet consists of dry, frozen rations. They must hold the hardtack near their bodies until it softens enough to chew. Digestion itself has slowed to a crawl. Their internal systems are prioritizing the preservation of vital organs. The extremities are left to fend for themselves. Fingertips have lost their sensitivity entirely. They notice that their reflexes have vanished. A tool dropped on the cabin floor remains there, untouched. It is too much effort to reach down and retrieve it. The psychological impact of this sustained exposure is profound. They no longer think about the journey home or the world below. Their entire universe has shrunk to the interior of the B-10. They are learning the limitations of the human form. Without constant fuel and heat, the body acts as a battery that is slowly, inevitably draining. They are watching their own energy levels flicker towards zero. One of the crew members notices a tremor in his hand. It is a rhythmic, involuntary oscillation. He hides it beneath his coat, afraid to acknowledge its meaning. Shivering is a caloric burn they can no longer afford. They attempt to stop the tremors by tightening their muscles in long, sustained bursts. It works for a moment before the body rebels again. They have reached a point where the distinction between awake and asleep has blurred. They exist in a grey, waking dream. The only reality is the bite of the frost against their skin. As the sun begins its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, the temperature drops further. The rate of cooling accelerates. The internal heat of the B-10 dissipates into the thin frozen air. They pull their limbs inward, tucking themselves into tight fetal configurations. They are conserving the heat within the torso. The cabin grows dimmer as the light fades to a bruised, deep blue. The metallic groan of the fuselage, shifting in the wind, punctuates the stillness. The structure is settling into the snow. It is a slow, creeping process of entombment. They have no more logs to maintain. The pens have frozen, and the ink has curdled into a thick, unusable paste. Their records have reached a final silent conclusion. A heavy low-pressure system is visible on the distant horizon. It is a wall of grey, moving with deliberate speed toward their position. The barometer is bottoming out. They feel the change in pressure in their inner ears. It is a subtle, nauseating shift. The impending storm will bring a decrease in temperature that the crew is not equipped to withstand. They look at each other through the gloom. There is a quiet, collective realization of their remaining duration. The threshold of their endurance is near. The wind rises, changing from a dull hum to a sharp, high-pitched whistle. It finds the gaps in the fuselage, channeling icy air into the center of the cabin. The temperature continues to slide. The last vestige of warmth is departing the cockpit. They sit, unmoving, as the frost begins to bloom across their heavy, winter-stiffened coats. The morning light does not bring warmth. It brings only a sharpened clarity to the isolation of the jagged granite peaks. The altitude, hovering near 12,000 feet, has thinned the air to a point where every movement requires a conscious, measured effort of will. The wreckage of the B-10 remains embedded in the ice, a dark, jagged scar against the pristine white of the slope. Its fuselage is partially buried, the aluminum skin creaking rhythmically as the wind pushes against the crumpled metal frames. There is no engine roar here. There is only the low, constant whistle of air through the gaps in the mountain pass. The pilot, Captain Miller, moves with a glacial, deliberate pace toward the salvaged storage crates. He reaches for the signal flares, his fingers stiff and clumsy inside his fur-lined gloves. The cold is not merely a sensation, it is a physical weight that presses against the joints, slowing the reaction of every nerve. The sky is a thick, bruised grey. The cloud cover is a dense ceiling, pressing down upon the summits, trapping the freezing mist in the bowl of the valley. It is an immovable barrier. Any signal fired into that suffocating expanse will be swallowed instantly. There is a small, hand-cranked generator recovered from the B-10's navigation kit. The wires are brittle, snapping like dry twigs under the slightest pressure. They strip the insulation with hunting knives, the metal blades dull and biting into their numb palms. The task of constructing the signal tower is methodical. They drag heavy ice-slicked plates of debris across the incline. Every step is an exercise in conservation. They know that a single slip, a single burst of sudden movement, will drain the precious, fading reserves of their metabolic heat. The signal fire is prepared with the last of the aviation fuel, held in a rusted canister. They pour the liquid over a pile of wreckage insulation and damp scrub. It pools in the porous ground, a dark, oily stain in the snow. The wind shifts, carrying the sharp chemical tang of the fuel. It is the only scent in a world of ice and stone. They stand back, waiting for the signal to be ignited. They are watching the horizon, not with anticipation, but with a weary, practiced neutrality. The flare is struck. A brilliant, harsh magnesium light erupts, casting long, flickering shadows against the valley walls. For a moment, the gloom of the mountain is pushed back. The world is revealed in high artificial contrast. The beam of light cuts upward, piercing the veil of the mist. It travels perhaps 100 feet before it hits the dense, churning mass of the cloud ceiling. It does not penetrate. It reflects, scattering into a weak, diffused glow that barely illuminates the immediate ice. They watch the light die. It is a slow, dying ember that falls back toward the earth. The silence that follows is heavier than before. The mountain, in its massive geological scale, seems to mock the small chemical flicker they have just exhausted. The clouds remain indifferent. They are a feature of the landscape, as permanent as the granite beneath the aviator's boots. There is no sound of an aircraft engine. There is no responding signal from the distant valleys hidden behind the range. The generator sits idle now. The wires, once stripped and prepared, are already beginning to frost over, the moisture in the air settling into a fine, crystalline layer of ice. The mechanical effort has yielded nothing but a deeper recognition of their scale. They look toward the vast, shadowed ridges that stretch into the horizon. To the human eye, the range looks infinite. It is a labyrinth of white and grey, an architectural maze designed to hide rather than reveal. They do not speak of the failure. There is no energy to expend on frustration. The loss of the flare is categorized mentally as a loss of supplies, a calculated reduction in the list of what remains. It is a factual deduction. The cold begins to seep back into their marrow. The momentary exertion of the signal attempt has left them sweating beneath their layers of heavy wool and leather. Now, that sweat begins to cool. It turns into a freezing film against their skin, drawing the warmth from their bodies with efficient biological cruelty. They turn back toward the shelter of the B-10 fuselage. Their boots crunch against the crusted snow, the sound sharp and rhythmic. Each movement is a negotiation with the environment. They move slowly to avoid overexertion. They breathe shallowly, to avoid inhaling too much of the biting, sub-zero air. The sky begins to darken again. The clouds have not moved. They have thickened, rolling over the ridges like a slow-moving tide. The light of the afternoon is already fading, replaced by the deep bruised violet of the high-altitude twilight. They crawl into the small space protected by the debris of the B-10. It is not warm, but it is sheltered from the direct path of the wind. They sit in the dark, listening to the metallic groans of the aircraft frame. The failure of the signal is a pivot point. It marks the transition from the expectation of rescue to the reality of endurance. The survival of the men is now disconnected from the world beyond the mountain. It rests entirely on the slow, steady depletion of their remaining resources. Outside, the first flakes of a new storm begin to drift down. They are small and hard, stinging against any exposed patch of skin. They accumulate quickly on the remains of the flare site, covering the oily residue and the charred insulation in a clean white shroud. The wind picks up, rising from a whistle to a low, mournful howl. It vibrates through the metal of the fuselage, turning the wreckage into a sounding board for the weather. It is a reminder of the immense, indifferent power of the altitude. They wrap themselves in the remaining parachute silk, tucking the edges beneath their bodies to keep the fabric from snagging on the jagged metal. They close their eyes. There is no panic, only the steady, methodical pulse of survival. In the dark, the sound of the wind changes. It becomes deeper, a rolling, rhythmic thrumming that shakes the loose debris on the ground. The storm is not merely passing through the pass, it is settling. The mountain has closed the door. The B-10 wreckage sits nestled in a bowl of jagged granite. 2 weeks have passed since the descent from the clouds. The silence of the high-altitude plateau is absolute. It is a weight that presses against the eardrums. The rations were calculated for a short ferry flight. They were never meant to sustain 4 men for a fortnight. The supply bags are now empty. The last of the hardtack was consumed 36 hours ago. Hunger is no longer a sharp, rhythmic pang. It has matured into a dull, systemic ache. The body has begun to consume its own reserves. Fat stores are depleted. Muscle fibers are the next to be broken down. Captain Miller sits near the fuselage wall. He watches his own hands. The skin is translucent, stretched tight over knuckles that seem to have grown larger overnight. The tremors in his fingers are constant. A caloric deficit at 12,000 feet is a physiological trap. The body requires energy to regulate core temperature. Without fuel, the internal furnace begins to flicker. The metabolism slows to a glacial crawl. The men spend the majority of their hours in a state of suspended animation. Movement is an expensive luxury. Standing up requires a conscious, labored negotiation with gravity. Even the simple act of breathing feels like heavy lifting. The interior of the fuselage acts as a heat sink. It conducts the external cold directly into the marrow of their bones. The metal walls are covered in a thick crystalline layer of frost that never fully melts. It glitters in the weak filtered sunlight. The thirst is a more immediate threat than the hunger. They have no source of liquid water. To melt snow requires heat, and heat requires fuel. They have no fuel to spare. They take small handfuls of compacted snow and hold them in their mouths. The temperature shock is profound. It leaches heat from the palate and throat. The body shivers violently in response to the intake of frozen water. Private Halloway attempts to reorganize the cargo hold. He moves with the mechanical stiffness of a clockwork doll. He shifts a heavy canvas tarp 2 inches to the left. Then he pauses for 5 minutes, chest heaving, waiting for his heart rate to stabilize. The loss of physical strength is matched by a decline in cognitive sharpness. Decisions that should take seconds now require long, silent deliberation. The brain is prioritizing basic survival functions. Everything else is being discarded. There is a strange, detached quality to their interactions. They exist in a shared, quiet bubble. Nobody speaks about the missing search planes. The sound of an engine in the distance would be a miracle, and miracles do not happen at this altitude. The journals remain open on the floor. The ink is viscous and slow to dry. Miller writes with an effort that leaves his hands cramping. His handwriting has devolved into a jagged, erratic script. The cold has seeped into the equipment. The metal triggers and hinges have seized. Everything has become a solid, monolithic block of ice. The tools they brought to signal for help are now frozen to the deck. The sun begins to dip behind the western ridge. The temperature drops another 10 degrees within minutes. The air becomes sharp enough to irritate the lungs with every intake. The men pull their thin coats tighter. They observe the horizon with a vacant, steady gaze. There is no urgency in their observation. The search for a rescue plane has become a habit rather than a pursuit of hope. It is a routine that fills the empty space of the day. The body begins to manifest the symptoms of advanced starvation. Edema begins to swell the ankles and feet. The heart works harder to pump blood through a system that is failing from the inside out. Each beat is a laborious thump against the ribs. The sensory world has narrowed to the immediate radius of the fuselage. Beyond the metal skin, there is only the wind. It creates a low, dissonant hum against the airframe. It sounds like a chorus of distant, hollow voices. Nightfall is the true test of endurance. Without the sun, the cold becomes an active force. It seeks out the gaps in their clothing. It probes the weakness in their joints. They huddle together, not for comfort, but for the preservation of heat. The warmth of one body is barely enough to keep the neighboring heart pumping. They lie in a rigid, motionless row. Sleep is dangerous, but exhaustion is absolute. They drift into states of semi-consciousness. In these moments, the reality of the mountains recedes. The memory of warmth and regular meals is a vivid, cruel ghost. Miller awakens to the sound of his own shallow breathing. The darkness inside the fuselage is total. He can feel the frost thickening on his eyebrows. The air in his lungs feels heavy, like thick, cold oil. The transition from night to morning is barely perceptible. The light returns as a grey, diffused wash. The world has not changed. The snow has not cleared. The rescue planes have not arrived. The inventory of the cabin is complete. Nothing remains that can be eaten. The leather straps have been chewed for their salt. The canvas has been scraped for any lingering residue. They are reaching the limits of human adaptation. The body can endure for only so long without an intake of energy. They have passed the peak of their performance. This descent into physical collapse has begun. Miller looks at the horizon once more. A thin, dark bank of clouds is rolling over the peaks. It is moving with a speed that suggests a shift in pressure. The weather is closing in again. The barometer on the wall, if it were still functioning, would show a precipitous fall. The air is growing heavier, the wind is beginning to change its pitch, a storm is coming, and they are empty. The maps are spread across the oak tables of the base headquarters. They are vast whitewashed charts of the northern interior, where the B-10 wreckage is assumed to be lost. The graphite lines representing the search grid look thin and fragile against the vastness of the territory. Every sector is defined by strict longitudinal markers. The air in the room is stale. It smells of wood-burning stoves and the dry, metallic scent of cold weather equipment. Outside the windows, the sky is a flat, featureless grey. It is the colour of iron. Meteorologists stand by the window watching the horizon. They report that the pressure is dropping steadily. A low-pressure system is moving in from the coast, locking the mountains in a cycle of static visibility. The planes remain anchored to the tarmac. Their wings are covered in a thin crystalline layer of frost that catches the dim light. Ground crews move with deliberate, measured steps. There is no urgency in their pace, because the environment makes haste impossible. To move too quickly is to risk overheating under heavy furs, leading to the lethal bite of moisture against the skin. They are calibrating the radio frequencies. They know the B-10 carried a localized distress beacon, but the signal is erratic. It bounces off the jagged, mineral-rich peaks of the range, creating ghost pings that lead searchers into dead ends. The logistical challenge is one of sheer crushing weight. To push into the interior requires sleds, heavy rations, and fuel. Every litre of fuel is accounted for. Every caloric intake is mapped against the estimated survival time of the crew. The military command does not speak of hope. They speak of probability. The statistics are laid out in columns of ink on pale paper. The temperature at the crash altitude is currently minus 35 degrees. Steel becomes brittle at this temperature. Metal components of the search equipment have been known to shatter upon impact or during heavy use. The search grid is subdivided into 10-mile increments. Each square represents hours of grueling, waist-deep traversing through powder that hides jagged volcanic rock beneath. There is a rhythm to the planning. It is a slow, methodical heartbeat of logistics. Data sheets show that the wind speeds in the high passes have exceeded 60 miles per hour. These winds turn loose snow into abrasive, blinding curtains that scour the paint from the fuselages of the grounded planes. The lead pilot stares at the charts. He traces the path the B-10 would have taken if it suffered total navigational failure. He realizes that the plane likely drifted 10 degrees off course during the final hour of flight. The search grid is effectively covering a graveyard that the current weather has rendered invisible. He marks a new sector on the map. It is the most inaccessible part of the range. A radio operator taps a rhythmic sequence into the long-range transmitter. The sound is a dull, repetitive click that echoes against the wooden walls of the command hut. The signal goes out into the void, hoping to catch a reflection from the portable transmitters the B-10 crew may have deployed. There is only the static of the atmosphere in return. It is a thick white noise that suggests the silence of the high interior. The lead meteorologist approaches the table. He lays down a final update on the barometric pressure. The report states that the front is not passing through. It is stalling. It is anchored over the search grid, trapped by the topography of the mountains. The ground teams will not be able to leave the base for another 48 hours. In the silence that follows the announcement, the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The searchers are immobilized by the very conditions they are trying to penetrate. They watch the snow begin to fall again. It is a fine, powdery substance that settles over the base, effectively burying their hopes for an immediate departure. They are waiting for a window of clarity that the mountains are refusing to provide. The lead pilot puts his pen down. He knows that in this climate, 48 hours is not just a delay. It is a physiological boundary. He turns to the maps one last time. He notices a pattern in the terrain that he had previously overlooked. The B-10 would have been pushed by the prevailing winds directly into the shadow of the northern ridge. It is a place where the sunlight never touches the ground. If they are there, the cold would have already begun to alter the landscape around them. The radio operator stops his tapping. He leans forward, his headset pressed tight against his ear. He adjusts the dial with a slow, agonizingly precise movement. A faint, rhythmic pulse emerges from the static. It is not the sound of a beacon. It is a faint, rhythmic thumping, erratic and weak. It sounds like something solid striking metal, carried over miles of frozen dead air. The room falls into an absolute frozen stillness. Everyone stops breathing, listening to the cadence of the sound. It hits twice, stops, and then hits once more. Then, the signal is swallowed entirely by the increasing howl of the wind outside. The silence atop the mountain range is not empty. It is a physical weight, a thick blanket of frost that settles into the lungs with every inhalation. The crew of the B-10 moves with the mechanical lethargy of men whose caloric reserves have long since been exhausted. Every movement is a calculated expenditure of energy. To lift an arm is to perform a task of great labor. They focus their remaining focus on the snowpack surrounding the wreckage. The white expanse is a desert, featureless and blinding. To be found, they must disrupt the symmetry of the mountain. They trudge back and forth, dragging heavy, jagged debris from the fuselage. They arrange the scrap metal into a geometric pattern, a long line, followed by a cross, then another line. The metal is brittle. It bites through their gloves and stings their palms with the intensity of an open flame. When they press their skin against the aluminum, the cold sears the nerves. They do not speak. They simply measure the distance between the pieces with tired, squinting eyes. They create a contrast against the snow, a man-made anomaly that does not belong in the high-altitude wilderness. The wind remains their constant companion. It carries the fine, powder-like snow and deposits it into the crevices of their clothing. It hides their tracks almost as quickly as they make them. They work in cycles of 10 minutes of labor followed by 5 minutes of stillness, leaning against the frozen earth to catch their breath. Their heart rates remain low, slowed by the starvation that has hollowed out their frames. The repair of the radio component occupies the interior of the cabin. The workspace is tight, restricted by the crumpled bulkhead of the B-10. Lieutenant Miller sits motionless, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He is working with a pair of pliers and a soldering iron fueled by a small sputtering flame. The air inside the cabin is thick with the scent of ozone and burning insulation. The radio unit is a fragile collection of wires and glass tubes. The vibrations from the impact have shattered the delicate filaments inside several of the valves. Miller holds a spare part, salvaged from a secondary communication array. His hands tremble, not from fear, but from the systemic failure of his body to maintain core warmth. He aligns the connection with precision. He is methodical. He does not rush. To rush would be to break the final circuit. He feels the grit of ice on the control panel, a fine layer of rime that has formed from their own respiration. He wipes it away with a sleeve of his heavy wool jacket. The movement is slow, deliberate, and painful as the fabric scrapes against the frostbitten skin of his wrists. There is a rhythm to the task. Connect, stabilize, test. The multimeter remains unresponsive, the needle pinned to the left. He breathes onto the connections, a small puff of steam that instantly solidifies into ice crystals. He waits for the thin layer of condensation to clear. He connects the battery lead. A low, guttural hum emanates from the speaker. It is a distorted mechanical sound that stands out in the stillness of the cabin. It is not music, nor is it speech. It is the sound of the electricity struggling against resistance. Miller adjusts the frequency knob, his movements microscopic. The hum shifts to a static hiss, then a series of rhythmic clicks. The distress signal is prepared. It is a sequence of pulses, a repetitive pattern of light and dark sound and silence. Miller presses the transmission key. He holds it down for the duration of the broadcast. Outside, the world is a monochromatic blur of grey and white. The snow continues to fall, draping the landscape in a soft, suffocating shroud. The broadcast is brief. It is a weak, flickering beacon sent into the void. It relies on the ionosphere to carry the signal over the peaks, and down into the valleys where, theoretically, a listening station might be monitoring the emergency frequencies. The transmission lasts for only 60 seconds. The battery, cold and depleted, begins to wane. The audio output fades into a long, low whine before falling silent. The mechanical life returns to the cabin. The only sound is the persistent, low-frequency whistle of the wind buffeting the remains of the B-10's tail section. The crew members look at one another. No words are exchanged. There's no joy, only the quiet acknowledgement that they have done everything within their power. They retreat into their sleeping bags. The insulation is thin, compressed by months of use and dampened by the melting snow. They pull the hoods tight, leaving only small openings for the intake of air. They close their eyes, waiting. The waiting is the heaviest part of the day. It requires a stillness that feels like death. The temperature continues to drop as the sun retreats behind the jagged horizon. The ink in the navigator's logbook remains frozen, a dark solid smudge on the page. The instruments in the cockpit are covered in a thick layer of frost. The silence of the mountain returns, deeper and more absolute than before. One of the crew shifts, the movement causing the structure of the wreckage to groan under the weight of the snow. The sound echoes through the cabin, a sharp metallic crack that seems to last for several seconds. It is a reminder of their fragility. They are guests in a landscape that doesn't permit human life to persist. Outside, the signal they sent has traveled miles, a thin ribbon of electromagnetic energy dancing through the thinning air. Whether it was intercepted, or whether it dissipated into the vastness of the atmosphere, is unknown. They lie in the dark, listening to the mountain breathe. The wind picks up, whistling through the gaps in the fuselage. The horizon darkens to a deep, bruised purple. The stars begin to appear, cold and distant points of light that offer no warmth. The crew remains motionless, wrapped in the cold, waiting for a response that does not come. The silence remains unbroken. A sudden, sharp, metallic ping sounds from the radio. It is faint, almost imperceptible. Miller opens his eyes. He stares into the darkness, listening for a second repetition. The silence returns, but the tension in the air has shifted. The radio is no longer a dead object. It is a question mark hanging in the frost. He reaches out a hand, hovering inches above the dial, waiting for the signal to return. The wind has ceased its constant rhythmic scouring of the basin. Silence now occupies the space where the B-10's engines once hummed against the thin, biting air. The snow is no longer a swirling veil, but a settled, heavy blanket of white. The rescue team moves with deliberate, measured caution. Each man is tethered to the next, their footsteps sinking deep into the crust. They navigate by the faint, distorted signal of the emergency beacon, a mechanical pulse that grows clearer with every yard. They're gained. Visibility remains poor, but the grey light of dawn reveals the jagged silhouettes of the peaks. The team crests a final ridge, their lungs burning in the oxygen-deprived environment. Below them, the B-10 rests at a slight unnatural tilt. The fuselage is scarred by the impact, its metal skin buckled and frosted. A thin plume of residual oil stains the snow beneath the starboard wing. There is no sign of movement, only the oppressive stillness of the mountain interior. The lead rescuer reaches the cockpit hatch first. He taps his gloved hand against the aluminum frame. He listens. From deep within the airframe, a faint metallic rasping follows. It is the sound of a human lung attempting to draw breath in the sub-zero dampness. The team begins the slow, methodical process of clearing the ice from the hatch seal. The metal is fused with the frame by a thin layer of crystalline ice. They apply a heated solution, watching as the liquid beads and freezes, again almost instantly. With a groan of tortured metal, the hatch gives way. The air inside the cockpit is stagnant and heavy with the scent of aviation fuel and human exhaustion. The crew is huddled together in the aft section of the fuselage. They have wrapped themselves in every available piece of fabric. yet their skin is pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Their eyes follow the rescuers, but there is little recognition in their gaze. The cold has slowed their cognitive functions to a crawl. Movement is painful, a rigid resistance offered by limbs that have remained motionless for days. The rescue team moves in silence. They begin the task of assessing for frostbite and internal trauma. They do not speak, for the effort of forcing air through frozen nostrils is a burden. One by one, the crew members are lifted from the wreckage. They are placed onto makeshift sleds, lined with thick wool insulation. The process is slow, dictated by the fragility of their state. Their bodies are brittle, their fingers are white, the tissue beneath the skin having long since lost its circulation. To move them too quickly is to risk fracturing the weakened skin. The descent from the basin is an exercise in gravity and patience. The rescue team manages the ropes, ensuring the sleds do not pick up the momentum on the incline. Each bump in the terrain requires a halt, a check, and a slow readjustment. The sky begins to deepen into a bruised purple as the light fails. They are still hours from the lower base camp. The temperature plummets as the sun disappears behind the crest of the range. The rescuers share a single thermos of warm broth, passing it between gloved hands. They do not offer it to the survivors yet, fearing the shock of temperature change to their systems. They focus only on the mechanics of the journey. Each survivor is strapped tightly into the sled. They are breathing, but their rhythm is shallow and irregular. The cold has claimed a portion of their energy that no amount of rescue can immediately restore. The path downward is a treacherous series of switchbacks. The sled runners leave deep parallel scars in the pristine snow. The team's lanterns flicker, casting long, dancing shadows against the ice-slicked rock faces. By midnight, they reach the sheltered ledge where the medical tent has been established. The transition is managed with clinical precision. They are moved from the sleds onto insulated cots. The medical officer begins the delicate work of rewarming. He uses tepid water and thermal blankets, stripping away the frozen layers of the flight suits. The skin underneath is grey, mottled with the dark, indelible marks of deep tissue freezing. The crew remains mostly unresponsive. Their survival is no longer a matter of flight or navigation, but of cellular endurance. The body is an engine, and these engines are stuttering, starved of warmth and momentum. A radio operator sits in the corner of the tent, his fingers stiff as he works the telegraph key. He sends a single truncated message to headquarters. The B-10 crew is located. They are being stabilized. Outside, the mountain begins to shift again. A soft, muffled sound echoes through the basin, the first slide of fresh snow settling on the higher slopes. The team stops, listening to the mountain's slow, shifting weight. The medical officer monitors the pulse of the pilot. It is a slow, thready beat that seems to hesitate between every stroke. He places a hand on the pilot's chest, feeling the rattle of fluid in the lungs. The recovery effort is entirely contingent on the next 6 hours. If the internal temperatures do not rise, the shock to their organs will be terminal. They are in the shadow of the peaks, held in a delicate, fragile stasis. The radio operator looks up from his equipment. He catches the eye of the medical officer. The signal from headquarters has been cut off by a sudden violent shift in the weather. The wind begins to rise again, picking up the loose snow and driving it against the canvas walls of the tent. The sound is a low, rhythmic vibration that vibrates through the cots. The rescue team settles in for the wait. They have done all that can be done. They are now at the mercy of the basin, watching the breath of the survivors as it hitches and slows, waiting to see if the mountain will release what it has broken. Legacy and historical impact. The steel frame of the B-10 remains a silent landmark in the desolation of the tundra. It sits exactly where the Earth claimed it, a metallic ribcage picked clean by the passage of decades and the relentless attrition of the wind. Nature does not distinguish between human ingenuity and common stone. It simply waits for the temperature to fluctuate, for the moisture to seep into the rivets, and for the oxidation to claim what was once forged in fire. The aviation industry did not look away from this wreckage. They catalogued every failure. They measured the exact point where the lubricants thickened into gel and the control surfaces locked into place. The 1935 B-10 incident was folded into the foundation of cold weather protocols. It forced a transition from the optimism of early flight to the clinical hardened reality of high-altitude survival. Engineers began to design for the absolute flaw of what the human body can endure. They learned that the difference between a pilot and a casualty is often found in the insulation of a single valve or the heating element of a primary instrument. The manuals changed. The training manuals were rewritten to reflect the precise, brutal lessons of the B-10. Pilots were no longer taught to simply fly. They were taught to survive the stillness that occurs when an engine fails in the absolute cold. It is a quiet legacy. It is found in the redundant heating systems and the survival kits that now reside behind cockpit panels, buried in gear that most will never need to open. But for those who do find themselves in the silence of the high altitude, the work performed on that crash site is what ensures they remain breathing. The names on the manifests have faded from memory, but their physical ordeal remains a permanent fixture of our technical knowledge. We build our safety on the bones of those who discovered the limits first. The sky does not offer mercy, it only offers lessons, and the B-10 was one of the most comprehensive lessons ever delivered to the world of aviation. If this history has left its mark on you, leave a like. It tells me you survived the journey, and that you understand the weight of the stories kept within the frost. Drop a comment below. I want to know what part of this survival story haunted you the most, or which mechanical failure you believe sealed their fate. The archives are deep, and the cold is never far away. Next week, we turn our attention to the uncharted depths of the North Sea, where a deep-sea exploration vessel fell silent in 1974, leaving nothing behind but a rhythmic metallic tapping that no one could explain. Until then, keep your vigil. The silence of history is rarely as empty as it seems.